Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a People Talk one-on-one special. Today I have a very interesting and intriguing guest on my one-on-one special. You'll know that I've already done one-on-ones with the Jamaican High Commissioner. I've done one-on-ones with Angela Ma and with Eddie Nestor MBE. And today I think I have someone else who can truly contribute to what we're trying to do here at People Talk, which is to inform and enlighten all communities, but very specifically the Black and Asian community, about things that directly affect us. As is my normal practice, I do not introduce my guests in detail. I leave that as something for them to do. And so I'd just like to welcome Wendy Williams. Hi, Wendy.
Hello, Paul.
Hi, Wendy. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself and obviously reveal to the viewers why you very specifically are here today taking part in People Talk one-on-one interview.
Yes, the reason why I've been invited to take part is because I've been asked to talk about the Windrush Lessons Learned review, which is a review that I carried out over a period of 20 months, and the report was published in March of this year. So in terms of me, a little bit about me, I'm a solicitor and I have been in private practice. I've worked in voluntary service and I've worked in the public sector. So I've worked in all three sectors. I have both defended and prosecuted in terms of criminal law, and I've inspected the Crown Prosecution Service, and most recently I was appointed, I think it's about 5 years ago, as one of Her Majesty's Inspectors of Constabulary and the Fire and Rescue Services, which is a real mouthful, and which means that I inspect the fire service and the police. And then I think it was in the summer of 2018, I was asked by the Home Secretary to carry out the Windrush Lessons Learned review.
I think it's very important that people understand the breadth of your experience, and therefore what I certainly believe gives you absolutely good qualifications to carry out such a lessons learned review. And I think one of the first questions that I think I'd like to begin with is maybe not specifically this report, but reports of this nature. What are the sorts of challenges that anyone would face trying to really get a lessons learned report out of something of such magnitude?
It's funny you should use the word magnitude, Paul. I'm going to major on that. I'd say one of the key issues was the sheer scale of the task, you know, the nature and scale of the task. So with a team, I undertook to interview, I think it was about 800 people, and they included people who'd been affected, their families and their representatives. I also interviewed members of staff at the Home Office from all grades, every grade, from the most junior through to the most senior, hundreds of those. And I interviewed politicians, past and present, including, I think it was 4 of the last 5 Home Secretaries, the Prime Minister at the time, and various other immigration ministers and others. We went through all 164 of the case files that involved members of the Windrush generation who were affected, and looked at, I think it was about 70,000 documents. So all of that information had to be absorbed, collated, analysed. Then I had to pull it all together into a coherent set of findings and recommendations and also into a coherent report that told the story of the people who were affected, the reasons why the scandal occurred, and what I felt needed to be done to avoid something similar happening again. So I'd say that was the major challenge, just the sheer scale of the undertaking.
So before we go into the details about, you know, your lessons learned, as you know, they're matters of public knowledge by now. We'll still talk about them later. But yes, certainly, you know, the numbers you were just there rolling out, you know, in terms of magnitude. Yep, fine. Magnitude is absolutely the right word. But I want to also talk about the dynamics of the nature of the people you had to interview.
Yes.
You know, some of the names of the titles that you mentioned, the last 5 Home Secretaries. Again, what was that like in terms of forthcoming, in terms of how they approach the topic? You know, you're laughing, but this is what I want to know. You know, when you sit down in front of them and you're interviewing them, what was that like?
It was fascinating. I mean, I've got to qualify what I say by making it clear that it was a confidential process. So I can't name names. I really can't name names.
Accepted.
But in terms of the experience, it was a fantastic experience to have that sort of access as a Black woman. There is nothing, there's nothing more challenging than being a Black woman speaking to senior officials and politicians about the issue of race. You know, in terms of the dynamics, that was really quite something. But it was something that I was pleased to have the opportunity to do. I was pleased to have the opportunity to explore their understanding or the degree of their understanding of issues of race, and importantly, of the history of the Windrush generation and their contribution to society, to post-war Britain, to rebuilding the post-war country, or to rebuilding the country following the Second World War. So that was it was quite an undertaking.
Now, I don't want you to get into trouble, but if you could summarize for me what your lesson learned from that process, forget the report itself. What's the lesson learned that you learned from having the access, not just to the Home Secretaries, but overall, to the overall, yes. What was the lesson learned that you learned personally from it?
In terms of the lesson that I learned, there were a few of them. The first was that some people really got it. And when I say got it, they understood the issues of race, they understood the history of the Windrush generation, they understood the issues that surrounded the scandal and what happened and why it happened. And that was pretty impressive. More, however, didn't. And that was the biggest lesson to me. Some got it, but you know, many didn't. And so it was important for me to try to draw out the understanding of the individuals concerned, to make it clear that I am independent. I was appointed as the independent advisor. I didn't go into this with any sort of preconceived ideas. When I carried out the roadshows, as I did around the country, when I had the privilege of speaking to hundreds of people who'd been affected and their families, one point that I made clear was that this wasn't prejudged. I was going to follow the evidence where it led me, and it might lead me into unpopular territory, but I had to be prepared to do that. So I think that was the biggest lesson that I learned, to try to get to the truth of what had happened, and to give everyone the opportunity to explain clearly what their positions were.
So I think that leads me nicely on to this question. and again, we're going to come to the lessons learned at a later point. There's been a lot of speculation about exactly what were the circumstances, the errors, the judgment calls that actually led to what we now call the Windrush scandal. Yes. In your view, what would you say led us there?
The scandal was a long time in the making. And that's the point that I've made in the report, Paul. This actually does go back over decades. I was asked to look at the situation between 2008 and 2018, and I'm sure there was a reason for that. But in doing so, it was clear that really right back to the 70s and the 80s, when successive governments sought to prove that they were being tough on immigration, various different immigration acts were brought in, and between 2008 and 2018, a particular policy which was called the Hostile Environment Policy. This was an immigration policy that was designed to deter people who had no legal right to remain in the UK, to deter them from staying in the UK, and to persuade them to return to their countries of origin. But the fact was that the Windrush group had every right to be here. They had British status, but they lacked the documents to prove it. And despite the fact that there were all sorts of warning signs, because they didn't register their status because they were told that they didn't have to. And we came across, and it's in the report, the internal circular that the Home Office produced, which made it clear that they didn't want to encourage people actively to apply for status because they were worried about what they termed there being a flood of applications that they didn't have the staff to deal with. So the point was that people were given various assurances that their status wouldn't be affected, but as the immigration controls tightened and tightened, the Windrush group were required to prove their status, but they were required to prove their status to an unreasonably high standard. I mean, I think you and I would both struggle to prove that we had lived in the UK continuously for a period of 50 years.
Exactly. I couldn't prove it.
Especially in circumstances where the different government departments don't speak to each other. So it isn't as if to say you could go to the tax office and they would immediately provide that information to the Home Office. So the point was that they were asked to prove that they'd been here for decades, and they shouldn't have been, because I think it's on page 10 of my report, I've reproduced the circular that was sent to Home Office staff saying, look, there are going to be people from the Caribbean who can't prove their status, and you should treat them with, I think the words used were sensitivity and discretion, but that didn't happen. So when they tried to prove their status and they couldn't reach that unattainably high standard, they lost their jobs, they lost their homes, they lost access to benefits like healthcare and their very sense of identity. And in extreme circumstances, some of them were locked up and returned to their country of origin. So that is the scandal. That's what happened. And I say that was foreseeable and it was avoidable.
I think, you know what, I'm always pleased when I do these one-on-one interviews, but I'm especially pleased because part of what you said cleared up something for me, which a lot of people who debate, obviously from a standpoint of having a political bias, we're always quick to say, well, you know, they should have sorted out their status long ago.
Yes.
I've never heard, and this is the first time I'm hearing that actually they were told, don't worry about it. It's not a big thing. We know your status. You're cool. And that for me is part and parcel of the true side we don't see. Yes. Because I know there are people arguing in good faith that they should have sorted out their status. And I remember in one debate I was having, I explained to the person that, for example, my mom and dad would have been caught in the same scandal had it not been that my dad decided, I don't like England that much, I'm going home. And so at that point, he was forced to take out travel documents. My mom made it a point, look, I understand we're going home, but let's make sure we got our citizenship sorted out and all of that. And it was that act that sorted them out and made them skip all of that. So I think it's a very important point because, like I said, people see that in the wrong way and they try to transfer blame. Okay, so.
Can I just make a follow-up point there? When I was doing the review, there were people that I spoke to who asked me the very same question. They would say things like, well, many people registered, or I registered, or others registered. Why didn't they? And that's why it was so important for me to understand the reason why.
Absolutely, I get you. I get you because it shouldn't appear to be negligence. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's a very important point. Look, great stuff so far. We have to go because we're on the clock.
Yes.
We have to go to matters of the lessons learned. And obviously your report is extensive, but I think we should just talk about the top three. What would you say are the top 3 lessons that you would like to see enacted? Because I'm a project manager by profession, and we do lessons learned, but we don't consider a lesson learned until the actions are taken. So right now, I'm just calling them lessons. What are the lessons that should become lessons learned? 3.
The top 3 are that the department has to accept that it has been guilty of a profound institutional failure. That's the first. Got to accept that it got it wrong. The second is it's got to open itself up to wider external scrutiny. And the third is that it has to accept that in carrying out its functions, whatever its policy objective, so I mean, looking at the Home Office, what's it responsible for? Some really contentious areas of public policy, protection, law and order, immigration, etc. But whatever the objective, its role has to be rooted in humanities. So you're dealing with people. So you've got to recognise that whatever the people you are dealing with, you have to respect them. You have to be alive to the possibility that they're vulnerable, and you have to treat them with humanity and respect. It's people, not cases.
You know what? I think, and I don't know if you watched the program Sitting in Limbo.
I did.
Which I watched. And when you talk about the third point that you raised about treating people with respect and humanity, even acknowledging that they had to pursue to find out whether people did have the correct legal status. 2 things you mentioned earlier. You talked about that unreasonable bar.
Yes. That
unreasonable bar of proof. But also, and I don't know how much of Sitting in Limbo was fiction and how much was fact, but the approach, the terminology used, the way people were referred to, the unreasonable bar, as you so put it, was disrespectful. It was truly disrespectful. And what I want to link that to, and I'll take your opinion on this, that one of our Black historians, he did a review into the Windrush situation as well. And one of the things he said, he found that there was also a gap of understanding of how someone of that age who is Black could actually be British. And he found that when he spoke to some of the Home Office staff, they couldn't connect the dots. They didn't understand the historical context. And I was wondering if you found that as well.
Yes, I think that there are a couple of things that occurred to me. The first is that when I interviewed members of the Home Office from the most junior to the most senior, there were some who, as I say, they got it and they said, we should have spotted this. we were getting warnings. There were junior members of staff who said, we were flagging these cases. We were saying, you know, how could this person that's sitting in front of me, you know, a grandmother in her 50s, how could she be having difficulty proving her status? But they said that they weren't listened to. There are also warning signs outside of the organisation, so various interest groups. They were writing papers, they were writing to the Home Office, they were lobbying, and they were saying, look, you've got your immigration policy, but it isn't being fairly administered. And there are people who are being trapped in this hostile environment net who shouldn't be there because they've got status. And the reason why that was allowed to happen, I've talked about a culture of disbelief and a culture of carelessness. Disbelief because people who made their applications, many of them were treated on the basis that they probably didn't have a right to be here. That was the starting point.
That was the starting point.
And I say carelessness because the Home Office's own circular, internal circular to its staff dated 2006 said there will be a group who can't prove their status but who have the status, so treat them with sensitivity and discretion. So yes, there were some members of staff who said we were flagging these things up. There were other members of staff who just didn't understand the history of the Windrush generation, and not only junior members of staff, you know, senior members of staff, politicians, you know, who didn't understand the history, the contribution of the Windrush generation to the post-war effort, and their status which was protected in law.
Wow. I remember watching this guy's name is David Olasade, I think his name is.
Yes.
He did the program that I was referring to. And I remember thinking to myself, how can that be? But then I reminded myself that it's very easy for it to be. And that's because, you know, and I don't want to take us off on a tangent, that's because the Black contribution within history is not taught. It is not acknowledged. It is not really taught and thought about in the context. And so it is very easy for a generation, unless they look for it, unless they probe for it, never to be taught about the contribution, and for them not to truly understand how someone who is, you know, 60, 70 years old could actually be on reality British.
Absolutely, and that's why one of the recommendations that I've made is that members of the Home Office are taught the history of the Windrush generation. You know, that is part of their training programme, because if you don't understand the history of migration to and from the UK, the history of migration to and from the Caribbean, and indeed the history of migration to other parts of the world as well, but my review was about the Windrush group. If you don't understand that history, and if you don't understand the complexity of immigration law and how it could affect people from the Caribbean, then potentially the Home Office is not carrying out its role as it should be.
We're almost at the end, and of course, I have to ask this question. How much, if at all, do you think the race of the people who were at the sharp end of this contributed to the mistreatment?
I have said in the report, race played a part. I have said in the report, I mean, I had to go into, you can't consider things like immigration, the Windrush generation and the scandal without considering the issue of race. And when I spoke to people who'd been affected, and I said to them, why do you think it happened? Some of them said, because of our race. And so I had to look at, you know, I couldn't not look into it. And I've concluded that race played a part. And it played a part because there was a lack of understanding of the issue of race. When I spoke to ministers, when I spoke to officials, when I spoke to members of staff in the Home Office and politicians, they some of them did understand issues of race, many of them didn't, and they saw race in very absolute terms. You know, everyone can identify the extreme forms of direct discrimination. But when you get into the more nuanced and the more sophisticated elements of discrimination, when you get into indirect discrimination, when you get into, you know, looking at the Macpherson definition, you know, it's the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate or professional service to people because of their race. You know, those are really complex issues, but if you're in those sorts of organisations, if you have those sorts of responsibilities, you have to understand the issues. So what I concluded was that there were elements of the Macpherson definition that were relevant to how the Home Office carried out its task. And whilst I didn't reach a definitive finding because of the limitations of my review, I didn't reach a definitive finding that yes, the Home Office is definitely institutionally racist. I did say there were sufficient elements that were there that I did see that gave me cause for concern. So in summary, race played a part, and the department has to address some of the issues, well, all the issues that I've raised in my report.
So of course, my penultimate question is, what's your confidence that the lessons will be learned and applied?
Well, when I consider the effort that went into this review, and I'm not just talking about me, I mean, there are countless people who really worked hard and worked with me and gave their utmost to help me put this review together. And the effort that has gone into the review on everyone's part is such that the Home Office has a responsibility to do right by the people who were done wrong. If they don't, then they only have themselves to blame. In answer to your question, I'm hopeful, but I can't say that I'm optimistic yet. I want to see the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the Home Office, I'm really pleased that the Home Secretary has said she's the Home Office is going to implement all 30 of my recommendations. And I think it was on the 23rd of June that assurance was given. And then in July, details were given in the House as to progress that had been made. But I'm saying there is a lot that needs to be done, and I am expecting to see progress. I have offered to go back in 18 months' time to review the progress the Home Office has made, but it won't give me any pleasure whatsoever if in 18 months' time I go back and see that little, if anything, has changed. That will have made all of our efforts, it will have made a nonsense of all of the efforts that went into this. The Home Office has got a window of opportunity, and that's both ministers and officials, and I hope that they take that opportunity.
Wendy Williams, look, it's been absolutely fascinating hearing perhaps what I will call a more direct and controlled understanding of what really has taken place. You've given us great insights, not just into the lessons learned from your report, but also into how this crisis came about. You confirmed things that we thought, and you've shed light on things that we had no way of really knowing. So I want to really thank you very much for taking time out of your busy day. It's been really, really insightful, and you know what? Let's hope that they do take your policies forward and see them for what they are, and avoid them in the past. Any last words from you?
Not for me. I've really enjoyed having the discussion. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't put in a quick plug for my report. Somebody said to me, I said to them, what did you think of the report? And they said, long, Wendy, long. But there are summaries, there's an introduction, an executive summary. Read the report. It's really worth, fully acquainting yourself with what happened. So thank you for allowing me that plug, Paul.
No. Plugs are free here. Thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to putting this out on social media so that people can get the insight that I've gotten today. And thank you very, very much.